Hi, I'm Britton LaRue, and this is Moon to Moon. Moon to Moon is a space to consider, celebrate, and share the ways we come home to ourselves, anchor through change, and uncover our power. 1 month, one phase, one loving step at a time. Hello, Moon to Moon. It's Britton, and I'm honored to be bringing you another episode in my new series, Unshaming the Houses. What I'm loving about what's starting to happen is that now that 2 have been out, and now a 3rd is coming out today, we're all starting to feel the beat of momentum when we sense a project is cohering into its rhythm and into its power and into its own life. I remember feeling with Unshaming the Signs, my project in 2023 in Instagram, that when you do the first one, there's this sense of like, do y'all see what we're doing? But it doesn't really start to land until the 2nd and then the 3rd. And then it's like, oh, I see what's happening here. Whoa. As like it starts to really move you and shift you. And that's what's starting to happen. As I'm participating in these conversations and anticipating the future conversations, I'm feeling the weight, the power, the gift that this series is going to be, shall I say, for all of us, like for the astrological community. These are really cool conversations. Oh my gosh. And I feel extremely honored to be stewarding this. So if you've come to this series for the first time and you enjoy what you hear here, I hope that you will go dive in. Go listen to the others. Maybe you're listening to this and along at some future date where they've all been published. They've all been created. I myself have been through 4 conversations. And so I have a lot to experience still ahead of me. It's really exciting. It's really exciting to be riding the momentum of now the middle of a project and feeling what happens when what is created gets disseminated, and how, as it gets disseminated, it creates a kind of living response from everyone it touches. So fucking cool. So here we are with our first cadent house. The cadent houses are the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th. And I've invited my friend Suprasensory Shahir to come and be the guest astrologer. This conversation drops into vulnerable beauty pretty quickly. I'm really grateful to Shahir for this because when we began, I felt just very expansive, just happy to be with this human being whose presence I really enjoy. And then Shahir brought us in. And what happened, I I really didn't anticipate. I don't know what to anticipate with these. It's really a dance with the human who comes in, and they're all different. So this one is just, it's really emotionally rich, which I find very moving, given that the third house is the house of the moon's joy. Let me tell you Shahir's bio. Suprasensory Shahir is a love devotee diviner, a queer mystic, Muslim mystic who believes in love in everything they do. Shahir shows up as an astrologer, tarot reader, and spiritual healer through their various crafts. And in the show notes, you'll see a link for a consultation, to their writing, to their YouTube, and to Instagram and Threads. Shahir and I share how we've been connected. It's been a few years since we've been finding a lot of delight and joy in one another's writing and speaking. And I just find Shahir to be a treasure of a human being and a deep well of love-based wisdom. So, without further ado then, enjoy Unshaming the Third House. Welcome to Moon, Shahir.
Hi, Britton. How are you?
I'm so happy to have you here in this space.
I am so glad. When I got the invitation, I knew we kind of like already planned for it tentatively for me to be on the Moon to Moon podcast. And then I was like, oh, I wonder what will it be, you know?
I wanted to have you on a long time. It's funny how like podcast invites work because it's like the desire comes in, but I don't act on it until there's like that's like a different kind of ping that activates the
Hmm.
invitation. And even then, the invitation, like with you, can just start with like a tap, and then we're still like holding, waiting for the right topic, and then the topic appeared.
I love it. I love it.
Oh, I always like to begin with just sharing with listeners how we are connected.
Mhm.
And I feel like maybe we're connected through Jonathan Coe. Are we connected?
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I was in your cohort for one of your classes. And through that, when Jonathan was like also teaching the class as well, right?
When Jonathan was helping with soft strength.
Yes,
Is
soft
that it?
strength. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
My previous lunar class. Yeah, I can't remember if that must have been 2021, maybe.
Yes, 2021. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved having you in there. And then I was following you, and I've just been such a fan for years. I love,
You.
especially when you make reels, I love your I love your
My
lunar
reels.
reels. Yeah. And then I received your prophecy reading
Yeah, the
yesterday.
yearly year ahead ones. Yeah. I love doing that. I love doing that so much. Yeah.
How
That's
long have you been doing it?
the year ahead ones. I think that was the fourth iterations of it. I changed its form over the years, but yeah, I've been doing it for 4 years. I think yeah, this upcoming one probably be the fifth year if I offer it, but I usually do offer it. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I've listened to mine 20 times.
I love that. Yeah, because it's so interesting, right? Doing those things is sort of like really trying to anchor people into their future. And that is such an interesting word, right? Sort of like full on, okay, this is the kind of idea that I'm getting. I don't even know how to put it into context yet because it hasn't happened. But whenever a person listens to it in the future, there must be something there for them to sort of like complement the storytelling of the prophecy, from month to month. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let me just anchor into saying that to receive a prophecy feels like an incredible gift to give yourself. And I wouldn't just want it from anyone. Like I really trust the frequency that you shine out into the world and trust your relationship to your practice.
Mm.
And it's a profound thing to receive divination. And just so grateful for what you offer.
Oh my God, thank you
You.
so much. Thank you. Thank you. I received
But
that.
yeah, there was really not much astrology in that. Actually, it was a more of a tarot and
Hmm.
oracular, I guess you could say,
Yeah, yeah,
experience.
impressions, and sometimes I get colors for people. I get smells sometimes too. It's very people specific.
I love that the card you pulled for Saturn this year was be
Uh-huh.
your own sugar daddy.
Yeah, I always like to incorporate some sort of like a funny decks in that. Oh my God, I love that.
Absolutely perfect. I could go on and on. Tell me before we dive into unshaming the third house. I'm curious how you came to astrology and
Mm,
like when you discovered your chart and maybe just a little background on your relationship
yeah.
to your practice.
Yeah, I think I definitely discovered other divination. Discovered tarot first. No, I discovered at the same time, but I went deep into tarot first. I think that's the thing. I think that was back in 2019. Yeah, 2019 was when actually um my life turned around, change for the better, the worse, the everything, right? Because at that time I was sort of like trying to find myself, or not trying to find myself. It's more about like finding the language to exist, I guess. Yeah, that's it. And then I found pop astrology first, obviously, and then I was like, wait, there's something more here. So yeah, it's in the same year, 2019, I was like going through a lot personally, um, internally. I think it's mainly internal. There are certain external circumstances that happen, actually was related to shame as well, which I can talk about also later as we delve into the topics a bit more. But yeah, and then from there, I had my spiritual awakening. And then, yeah, I kind of like, I don't know why, I picked up astrology really quickly. Yeah. And then I think I definitely have some placement that is considered like blessed, when it comes to like divination and all those things. So we're talking about the third house as well, which is an important house for divination. So yeah, so that's where I started, my starting point.
Hmm.
Mm.
Finding the language to exist, you said. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, how great is that for our topic? Ooh. Wow. All right. So tell me then, when I said to you, hey, would you like to come on for Unshaming the Houses? And you were like,
Hmm.
is the third house still open? Tell me about your relationship to the third house that drew you to wanting to speak to it. And
Oh,
I'd love for you to talk about your chart to the
oh my
degree you're open
God.
to.
Yeah, of course, of course. Um, so this is where I think shame really baked into it as well with my third house, because I think one of the signification of the third house in astrology is the house of siblings, right? Um, and I very much relate to the idea because I grew up in an environment where so let's a bit like define the third house, right? The third
Mhm.
house is a place where for me at least how I learned about it, it's a place where there is a sense of familiarity to it, and that's why it's related to like the local environment, the siblings, the brothers, the sisters, the people, your neighbors, even like relatives, and etc. are considered like the third house in terms of like relation wise. And then we're thinking about spatially as well. We're thinking about like the neighborhoods, the school that we go to, maybe even the cafes that you frequent. Those are like third house spaces as well, right? And another thing that is the third house signification is about skills, education and those things. And so mine is kind of like intertwined all together, where I kind of know I want to talk about the third house because it's where my Saturn lives, right? And um, Saturn, in some way, for me, is a planet that is related to shame in a bit, right? As well, because Saturn doesn't enjoy being put into the public, right? It's kind of like it's hiding something, and there's something that you sort of like constrain yourself like into. Um, and one of my earliest experience of shame really come from there because I grew up, I'm a 93 baby, but I grew up at a time when my older brother, right, the signification of like brothers, my older brother has autism growing up. And so throughout my life, a lot of my experience of like early life, childhood, has always been intertwined with my brother because I'm always like his buddy. I have like seven siblings. I'm number 6/7, so there are lots of us. But my brother is the one closest to me. He's 2 years older than I am. And so, and growing up, I was always realizing how like people with autism in a certain degree, they do have some sort of like quirky habits and things like that. My brother is nonverbal. I mean, he can speak a few things, but it's not like he can fully like say out loud the words that he could like all his thoughts. So he has some sort of like developmental difficulty, and so I think I that was my first interface with like a sense of like societal shame that was like ingrained in my family, right? And also like in my interaction with the environment. Like whenever I'm sort of like outside with my brother, there's always this sense of like almost like having to explain ourselves, right? But just because like he has disabilities, right? And so there's always that sense of like shame, like with regards to like the interaction with the environment. And so one of my earliest like um remembrance of like history with him was like when we went to school together, right? And I remember there was this one teacher. I think she wasn't a great teacher, obviously, but she basically like called my blood brother in front of the class and basically like humiliated him and saying like, oh, he's stupid and all those things, like all those derogatory words. And and that was like one, and I was in the same class with him because, because I was there to like assist him. So I was like in my kindergarten, but in the afternoon, I followed my brother to his school so that I was like accompanying him. And so I think that experience was like, wow, like I was like witnessing my brother, right? Being shamed because of his sort of like mental and like developmental sort of like capacity. And I was very young, right? And I was like, wow, and then I think that was like one of the earliest experience of like there's something like I was like grappling. I don't know. Obviously at that time I was like, what am I feeling? Like I was still like probably 6 years old. And I was like, oh, okay. There's something like I was feeling and for better or for worse, like because of that experience, like very sort of like punishing and kind of just like that sort of like trauma, I would say. Um, I really ended up like excelling in my school. I mean, I became like very smart. Like I was like, my God, like my parents, like I have an older brother and he's not able to sort of like the idea of like contribute to society, quote unquote, right? And so, yeah, and a lot of, and I think even at that age, I remember like my mom, like I think she was grappling with her own shit, and like she was grappling with her own humanity, I guess, with regards to like having a child. And at that point, like there was no like intervention, like, you know, these days, like a lot of like autism, there's a lot of sort of like support right around it, but even then I'm pretty sure there's still problems with it. But you know, she was raising my brother at a time where it was still like stigmatized, and you know, like even in my culture, there was always like thinking that, oh, like if you have a child that is sort of like, you know, have some sort of disability or whatever, it's almost like on you, right? It's almost like there's something that you did wrong in, and when in fact it could have just been a biological thing and genetics and things like that. um or even if it's a nurture thing, you know. And so yeah, and so I think I know, yeah, I'm really feeling that as sort of like entry points towards the third house and the experience of like shame there, where there was a lot of this sort of like questions about skills, maybe, or even questions about the people around you, the people that you have some sort of like bonds with, in terms of your early childhood environment. And so, yeah, I just want to stop there for a bit and, you know, see
Mm.
that's vibrating for you, or yeah, where do you want to go with this?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for sharing your story. And my heart really feels for little you, just wanting to be supportive and sensing this environment that is just deeply not supportive, and what to do with that reality. Like, that's so much for a child. Well, thank you for bringing us in there. That's super tender, and I appreciate it.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, yeah, you've just dropped me in, and like I hadn't really fully felt the terrain of the third house in this way until you took me there, because you're bringing this in, this piece around like vicarious shame and vicarious
Mm-hmm.
trauma, which is something that so many of us know and have confusion around since it didn't happen to us. And I hadn't
Mm-hmm.
thought about how the third house relationship to siblings and close associations can speak to this piece that is so common in shame and in trauma, which is when we know it vicariously, and there's this sense of being overwhelmed by not knowing what to do or how to help.
Yeah, oh my God, that is so true. That is so true. And
Mhm.
and I was really thinking about like the third house is considered like, you know, it's the joy in Hellenistic and ancient astrology. It's the place where, you know, there's a lot of care actually in the third house, right? Because um it's the place where the moon has planetary joy. Um and the moon is sort of like where the people are. And so that's why I was like really thinking about like the third house has a lot to do with like that sort of like interaction of shame in our lives, that we're sort of like, oh, like, is that okay? You know, if someone acted in a certain way, is like, is that okay? And thinking about like the relationships that we have in our lives. And so, yeah, so I was really thinking about like the siblings, and, you know, for people that even don't have siblings, it could really be like the people who you grew up with, right? Is there any sort of like shame that you are burdening yourself with, or even like you're carrying without even you realizing? Um, because the third house is a place where you kind of like form your worldviews in a lot of ways as well, right? And so, which for me, I see the third house as such a very formative experience because your surrounding will sort of like the shame of your surrounding will feed into your thoughts, right? Which is also the third house sort of like signification, right?
Yes.
What the inner knowing, right? In a more modern kind of like thinking of the third house. Um, and so I was like, what is actually like what is this shame that was like being fed to us, basically, right? When perhaps we have less power over it. Because in some ways, um, the way the houses are oriented, people always believe that like the third, the ninth, the 12th, the sixth, they are Caden houses, right? They are houses that are falling away, and there is sort of like less power or like less efficacy in those houses. And mainly it's due to sort of like it's about other people mainly perhaps with the third house. It's about but also about how you absorb it, and how that makes way for your own inner authority or even your inner words, that how you have conversations with yourself and things like that too. um, so that rings true to me with the third house and how important it is to sort of like go back. I guess I think a lot of like unshaming the third house perhaps is doing the work of going back to our childhood experiences, right? Like it's almost as if we can't escape it because the third house is the early child environment in a lot of ways too, right? We're thinking about um, it's the place where we develop some sort of like skills to navigate this world, right? It's almost like that's I see the third house as the skills, and that's why, it's like the second to the second house, meaning that like the first house is the self, the second is money, the third will then support the second through our skills and and so I was really thinking, and that's why like the signification of like communication, like, talking, being literate, right? The ability to say something and having conversations, those are very third housey in lots of ways as well. Um, and so I was just sort of like thinking about that, like skills as being like a third house things too. Yeah. Yeah.
This is so rich. Thank you. Yeah, I'm dropping into to thinking about the way third house significations play with shame, given that so much that I'm learning about shame is the way it operates under the surface of our awareness and
Mm.
affects the way we see the world and the way we tell stories and the way we talk about ourselves without us being totally aware of the role of shame in these perspectives and how so much of what we associate with like third house affairs are parts of life that we do sort of like unthinkingly, like moving around the neighborhood, doing your daily activities, like the devotion of going to get your food, for dinner at the store, the people that you're running into as you go along the day. And a lot of those parts of the day we think of as like not really that important or not
Mm-hmm.
really part of how we're like manifesting our dreams, But in this way, where shame can creep in, that can and like take hold in this foundational way, it shows how like it's unseen.
Mm.
And so talking about it now is like I'm seeing what I couldn't see before we just dropped into this.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of the moon, thinking about the moon as in their joy in the third house, like the moon relating so much to the past and
Mm-hmm.
to the inner children who um, came to see the world the way they are seeing the world that still live
Mm-hmm.
within us now. Um, I hadn't really thought about how the moon's relationship to the third house can also relate to the way the shame we carry is often very much an under the surface aspect of the way we're interfacing with the everyday.
Mm, yeah. Oh my God. True. That is so true. It's sort of like, and I became very almost hyper aware of it. I have Aquarius Saturn. I also have a lot of spirit in the third house. So, that's sort of like very me to talk about it too. Um, and I remember I actually wrote this sort of like article. It was published in a book, as part of like a compilation of like letters. And I wrote something about like, how our attitude, right? And sort of like, and so funny, like it really in that letter or in that essay, I was talking about like how my experience of like going out in the public and people sort of like making certain faces towards my brother and things like that, right? Like people who might not even know, and I don't even like sort of like sometimes you can't even blame them because they thought that see, this is where like the idea of like the perception of like an able-bodied person, right? um and so like it's like for me it has always been loud, it's always been like I'm always like aware, if I'm at spaces. I'm always almost like having this sort of like hyper vigilant mode, right? To be
Mm.
some sort of like responsible, quote unquote, right? There's a sense of duty there, which is very Saturnian in a way. And so it is about our sort of like the moon, right? As you were saying, it is very familiar. And that's why maybe sometimes we might not even analyze it, right? It's sort of like, yeah, like I coexist with people around me, like like if we're thinking about like the third house as the siblings, and the reason why is because in the ancient times, people do have siblings, if they do, and those are the kind of like people that they interact with the first, right? Obviously except the parents and things like that, but like those are like the kind of like the cohort or like the environment that was facilitating a child's experience of the world. And so I was really thinking about that sort of like, and maybe that's why we it's easy for us to like discount it because it's just it can be feeling very mundane in some ways too, right? It's sort of like going to a supermarket and then like, but then for me, like for me when I was a child, I was like, oh my God, going in public with my brother, like, it's almost like I have an added responsibility whenever I'm in those spaces, although it's kind of like a given thing or whatever have you, right? Um, so yeah, and which makes this interesting because in ancient times, people do equate, because it's the house of the goddess, the house of the moon. People do equate it with like some sort of like, there's a sense of divinity that exists there as well, right? In the third house, and sort of like really in the idea that mm, the people that you meet are sort of like divine in themselves. And I think there's something about like the very third housey, very lunar aspect of like really interfacing with like the everyday people and kind of like seeing the divine in them. Um, there's something there about like perhaps part of the process of like, you know, unshaming the third house is actually finding the divine in the sort of like daily encounters, actually.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I was thinking about support, and thinking too about how the moon governs daily habits.
Yeah.
And like our habits can, from a shame-based place, many of us cultivate habits compulsively to like fix ourselves or feel better or
Mhm.
manage or discipline what's wrong with us.
Mm.
And that from an unshaming perspective, through the kind of the same means we can love ourselves is
Mhm.
through reweaving daily habits in a devoted way, in a like a moon way, to like the temple of love, basically,
Mhm.
and build daily habits from that place rather. How does
Yeah.
that feel?
Yeah, no, I really, agree with that. There's something about the third house. It's about like how you sort of like the daily, like what the daily habits that you do, will sort of like help to regulate it or even remediate it in some ways and, give some sort of a support to it that the third house has. And it's like kind of like for me, there's something also about it that sort of like it is about supporting the mind, and the body and, the alignment of it all. That comes with that. There are moments of sort of like whenever we feel less centered or, we need a bit of like, I need my alone time, I need my quiet time or something like that. Which for me is important with the third house because it can be very busy too. And I was also thinking about like, yeah, the third house is like a liminal space where it can get just very busy and it can also be quite so much about like the surroundings and other people that we sort of like forgot or even we got lost in the sauce, right? In sort of like, okay, what are my thoughts? Like, what is it that I am internally thinking rather than because it is a house that it is sort of like the beginning house that wants to relate, right? That it's sort of like there's a lot of sort of like energy there, which might not be ours to sort of like hold on to as well. So I was just also thinking about that as like sort of like a third house experience, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, I have Gemini in the third house, and sometimes like some astrologers associate the third house with Mercury
Mm-hmm.
and with Gemini, and I have Jupiter and Gemini there. And maybe too, this is why it was like slower to locate where my shame is because it's like that's my Jupiter space. Like what? It's a happy place.
Yeah.
So, um, but I do think it's a very stimulated place for me,
Mm-hmm.
hyper stimulated place. And it's funny, I had two younger brothers that were like nearly the same age and looked very similar. It's like very Gemini. And I just like loved being their big sister. And then I become
Oh.
like lifelong student and, hold a lot of third house space.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very happy. I'm very happy here. But creating devotion is like a slowing down that has more come in at midlife because I think that I spent a lot of my life not really knowing where that inner divination came from, where the
Mm-hmm.
inner knowing came from, because it was like the hyper stimulus of information everywhere all the time,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is fun, but not super supportive in terms of like kind of rooting into a compass, I feel like.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is also like part of the sort of like not being ashamed of whatever your thoughts are actually, right? I think that's like the work of the sort of like
Mm.
the third house too, right? Because um we're dealing with like I always love to look at the third house and the ninth house. The ninth house can get very world it's big things, right? It's sort of like it's the sun, it's like the place where the truth or like the big tree truth or it's where like the idea of like religion or the idea or like the big ideas are all in the ninth house, right? But then the third house is like opposite it. It's sort of like how does those big ideas shine into your sort of like everyday practice. I think that's the third ninth sort of like unshaming process. There's this sort of like opposite house, sort of like unshaming process where, for example, right, as a person, for me, I identify as like a queer Muslim, although, people, some Muslims out there might say that, oh, no, that you don't exist, like my existence, you shouldn't, like, I can't exist in that sort of like spectrum, right? But how do you sort of like take on all these big ideas of the idea of like religion and all those sort of like big thinking philosophy in the ninth house, and how does that light shine on the third house actually the third house then responds to that light, right? And that's why it's like the sun and the moon rejoicing places, the sun shining, the light, the moon becomes a reflector. The moon has its own tint to it, right? Understanding of it. And so then the third house then become your own inner knowing based on all this, all the things that we learn, right? And the third then becomes our like holding ground for like, okay, like it's the light is like this, but I'm reflecting it differently, right? It's sort of like, oh, the scriptures are saying something, but I don't believe it 100%. What I'm feeling is actually this, right? And so that is where I think where that's what the sort of like people in the magical circles, right? They always talk about what's the term they use? UPG is that thing? Something about personal and
Unverified personal gnosis.
yes, we use that UPG a lot, right. That's the third house thing, I feel, right? It's
Yes.
a personal gnosis house. It's like,
Yes.
the gnosis itself might come from, the ninth or like whatever, but the personal, gnosis, the UPG part, that's your third house. And nobody can say that that's sort of like wrong, in some ways too, right? People can't negate that if that is how you experience. And that's why the third houses has a lot to do with more sort of like immediate divination, or like something about like sort of like, oh yeah, that's how I experience it, and this is my truth with it, right? And that's why all astrologers are different and things like that too, right? Because I think there's something about the third house in a way to speak to the personal style of that person, ultimately, of how they sort of like have all this information coming in, and how are they applying it or perhaps propagating it in the third house. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I love this so much. Yes. I saw somewhere that an old word for third house is praxis.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the praxis of like taking the big truths, taking the concepts, taking the dogma, or taking the
Mm-hmm.
rules, taking whatever, the beliefs, the cosmology, and then living your life, but it's going to live through you, through your own ways.
Mm-hmm.
And where's your
Yeah.
connection to that? Um, that's
Yeah.
so rich. And where shame is, wherever we have shame, which we all have shame,
Yeah.
we struggle to trust ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that speaks to like unshaming the third house is related to trusting your own knowing in the way you praxis, the way you practice what you believe to be true, which is going to
Yeah.
look different than your teacher,
It would definitely look different
and
in
your
your.
classmates.
Yes, yeah. It's a third. And, it is your like, that is it's you. It's kind of like, it's how your body, your mind sort of like process it. And that's why, and that's why it is a house of learning, and it's sort of like it's very receptive, but it's like, the third house is a house of like learning and communication, right? Which, in a lot of ways, I feel like I've been kind of like, growing up, I would say my third house was pretty blessed in a lot of ways. I was always excelling in school. I think that's the Saturn part. I was like, getting into like a great university and things like that. But even then, sometimes there is a lot of like pressure there. But like, if we're thinking about like the third house as a house of education in a more formal sort of like way, right? That's why the third house is associated with like education, right? It is like the inner knowing and how we apply it. That's the praxis. But then in our current world, it's kind of like, oh, it is about like education, because that's one of the metrics of life, or when like, that's one metric of praxis, I guess, right? When you learn something, whether it be formal or informal. So yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm thinking too about from this, like the association of the third house with like chit chat and gossip and like, yeah, like the daily conversations that we have,
Mm-hmm.
and how like if you, when we, like one part of us believes it to be true that we are a certain kind of person because we believe certain kinds of ninth house things.
Mm-hmm.
But then the daily chit chat or in the gossip, we kind of find out how much we want to live by the dogma and how much we just want to
Mm-hmm.
talk about whatever we just want to talk about. And
Yeah.
but those like ruptures in our identity where we're not really feeling connected to the way we want to be living, that's where shame can grow, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, no, definitely. I feel that so much. And I think a lot of people, I mean, astrologers and, tarot readers, diviners, witches, like listening to a podcast, I think there's something about like when you first started, right, in your own spiritual journey, there is something there about like you're kind of like rewiring and already like you're kind of like unshaming already your third house a bit, right? Because you're kind of like, yeah, I kind of have this knowing that is coming from I don't know where. Like it's like, and it's like it's just like, this is what I have to say, or like this is what I have to sort of like learn and deliver perhaps as well, right? And there's something there about like really unshaming that like process of how do we experience knowing perhaps, right? Like, and then that's where we're going back to like the idea of it being a very internal and intuitive. Yeah, it's really a question of like unshaming our knowing in a lot of ways too. It's like what are the ways of knowing, right? We can ask ourselves that, and sort of like, and how, and through our experience, right, which can feel very third house, our way of knowing also changes over time, right? We might used to be very studious, and then, and can also change, right? For example, like, I used to be like, oh, I was to be like, what, reading all the astrology books and all those things. And then I was like, okay, all right, that ways of knowing is changing for me now as a practitioner, right? Now I'm more interested in something else, right? And even then, even I mean, for me, even if we're so already intimately into that, like we know that's part of the gig, right? We know that's part of, but then we also feel a sense of shame. I'm like, oh my God, I'm not, like, for example, like I have to be honest, like I used to prepare so much for my client work that I was like, and then there was a point where I was like, why am I like, I feel like I'm overextending my capacity here, right, as a human being. And then I was like, I don't need to be doing that as anymore. And not because it wouldn't even affect my reading quality even, right? It's sort of like, and even then there's a shame whenever we just change, that because of third house, right? Like whenever we change the way we practice something, right? There's already that, because there's a sense of like wanting a sense of like fixity there, when in fact it's a very liminal and changing house. I would say like it is a house that is like falling away, meaning that it is trying to like it's changing its form, as well. So yeah, there's something there about the third house. It's like constantly changing.
Yeah, I really love that you brought that in. I mean, it's the cadent houses all have that between realms
Mm-hmm.
quality about them. And in that sense, why would you have consistency or constancy in your practice?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And also I'm feeling into, as someone who came into learning intuition at midlife and who helps other folks hear their own inner voice, there can be this sense from a shame place that, like, what if I don't have any profound thoughts? Like, what if
Mm.
there are no thoughts that are coming to me for my own gnosis? Like, what if I'm just born to not experience gnosis? Like, maybe that's for some people and not other people. Like, I think that can be a real fear. And the truth is, every time you sit down with your guidance, can be there's a heartbeat that lasts a half a second to minutes and minutes and minutes where you're afraid that maybe you won't receive anything, or like maybe nothing will appear for you.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that doubt may be part of the process of knowing.
Yeah, no, definitely. I see that as sort of like it is not like and like the doubt almost like has to coexist in there, right? You know, sometimes you're sort of like even playing with it, even like I would always sort of like, and that's why like shame for me is like, yeah, shame is always afraid whenever there's, I was gonna say afraid, like I do believe there's something about play that helps with shame, right? If we're thinking about like shame as very Saturnian or even like Martian, and then there's something about like the sun, like the solar plot, like parts of it that is about like play, like, you know, and so how like do I like with the doubts I have with regards to my own knowing and like, oh my God, you know, like how do I sort of like play with it and to create that sense of like, okay, like I don't need to be taking this too seriously, although it is a serious matter, right? But then I can allow that sort of like space between that. Yeah, I don't know. There's something there about like because I think I think that's natural, right? That's maybe part of, you know, even right now, as a longtime diviner, even sometimes I'm like, oh my God, am I losing my gifts? What is going on? You know, you have those moments where you're like, I feel that what is this card like, you know, it just feel a bit like funky in a way, and you're like, okay, can I still do this, you know? And so
Oh, they've abandoned me. Oh,
right. So yeah.
yeah. It really brings us back to the beginning, speaking about prophecy, just that
Mhm.
talk about going into the dark, you know,
Yeah.
and trusting your own knowing that you're just going to say what comes to you, it comes to your mind, your thoughts, this third house.
Hmm.
And I think that part of the unshaming can be um, helping hold the parts of you that want to please the other person, or like be right,
Hmm.
or come across as skilled, because that will take you away from just speaking what you're seeing.
Yeah, no, I agree so much with that. And I was thinking about like the ancient delineation of the third house has to do with like sacred rites, you know, it's sort of like
Mhm.
when you're being initiated as sort of like a priestess or a priest or whatever, it's very third housey in a way. And there's something there about like, yes, allowing the liminal, right? Allowing the unknown to kind of like you're in a way you are releasing some sort of like control a bit in the third house for sure, before you're able to like grasp whatever that is meant to be. So it's a very channeling sort of like house too, for sure. As a place where we receive knowing and divination and things like that. So yeah, like whenever we do divination, we are trying to be more intimate with the realms of the unseen, unheard, you know, all those areas of life which are not according to our senses, right? It's like it's the sixth sense, right? People call it, right? And there's something there about like in order for you to tap into that clair or that whatever sense, you need to sort of like we need to sort of like be in a space of like, oh yeah, there's something I don't know about myself. And maybe even that's part of like creating the space for it to be receptive to something. Yeah. So I always find the third house as sort of like it's a very receptive house actually too. Um, and so maybe that's kind of like part of the kind of like unshaming process to it because it's very lunar, right? It is very receptive. It wants to receive something from the environment, right? And yeah, so yeah, something there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciate this so much because I think from so much of us have known cultural conditioning and like education systems, to go back
Mm-hmm.
to the beginning, that brings up competition and comparison and judgment and shame, such that we learn to cultivate these patterns of tightening and bracing and
Mm-hmm.
hypervigilance, so that it's difficult to be receptive to our own
Mm.
information.
Yeah. Oh my God, true. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, there's definitely there about, yeah, like the structures in which we measure intelligence or measure, our like, yeah, and that's why I really like the idea of the third house being skills, right? And even like we always talk about like, oh, if you're a skilled labor or you're unskilled labor, like that's more like economics or like government, like kind of like policy making, kind of like thinking, right? Or
Mhm.
now they're more PC about it. They call it low skilled labor and high skilled labor, for example, right? And really trying to like think about it, like what does it mean actually, right? Is a person making me food considered low skilled labor? Like we have to really like sort of like question that as well, with regards to like how, yeah, and how like shame is actually like being, it is being, sort of like weave into sort of like our understanding of like what we're capable of as well, whether it be like intellect, like linguistic skills, motor skills, whatever have you, speaking skills, that's very that house as well. So there's something about like having to, break the mold of whatever that is being conditioned to us. And the third house is like it's a place where we are being conditioned in itself, right?
Yes.
It's sort of like there's this sort of like process of like, oh my God, this is the place where I am being conditioned. Like, and now I need to sort of like break free from it or work with it or do something with it, right? Yeah.
Yes. You just said this is the place where I'm being conditioned.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And most education systems, um, like many systems, it's very hierarchical based on
Mm-hmm.
some set of standards, these ableist standards.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah.
Rather
Yeah.
than a situation that where we look around and see different types of skill living in different kinds of beings and
Mm-hmm.
appreciate what each different person is bringing.
Yeah, yeah. And exactly come to the point where, I'm not trying to like glorify ancient society or whatever, but like there's something about like, how people call like, the in the past, right? The local priests or whatever, the local shaman and things like that. Their needs and their cares are being taken care of by like society or whatever. And there's something there about the third house too, right? Because it's almost like you are sort of like your skills are contributing something to the environment, and the environment takes care of you, right? And which is very lunar too, right? You're supposed to sort of like love your neighbor, right? You shouldn't treat your like, neighbors and guests are sort of like one of those important people in life, but like sort of like this idea that um it's sort of like, what, because we live in a world where, like there are certain sort of like money attached to like things and all those things, right? But like that is something about we learned in the past where the communal perhaps is more aspect of like the people in your locality, um as sort of like you have skills that you contribute to that local environment, and you're actually being reciprocated in ways that are perhaps less material, right? But it's different. It's like it's a different way of like relating, and where there's like reciprocity that exists in such environment. So obviously, I'm not sort of like generalized where this could be everyone's, experience of the third house, but like, there's something there about like, for example, when I was living in New York, I'm always like going to my local coffee, like my everyday coffee person. It's like, there's only, I know all the baristas' name, right? And I go there, talk to them, and, sometimes I get free coffee. Sometimes I do free divination for them, that sort of like very third
Yes.
house things where like you don't even really like you're not even being calculative about things, right? There's something there that is actually very lunar because you do consider them, oh yeah, they're part of my environment. And so I want to take care of them. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. Oh, I felt very weepy as you were speaking because you like brought us to a possibility space of where
Mm-hmm.
we could be together, and it's really
Mm-hmm.
beautiful. Um, and I think probably in in an unshamed, um, more uh, healed way, that neighborhood would also include the spirits of the land,
Mm-hmm.
and that too, at least I feel in my neighborhood or like where I live, it's just there's a numbness to the relationality of that aspect of the third house experience
Mm-hmm.
that is a loss for us. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's true. Yeah. And yeah, and then yeah, if you walk around, right, the third house, it's kind of like the house where you walk around, right? And that's why I think it's a liminal place, right? It's sort of like, oh, who owns it? Sort of like and I think there's always something about the third house too. It's sort of almost like it's kind of like you're even not saying you don't care, but like there's a sense of like whenever, for example, you walk around, right? Like, oh, whose property it is, or like whose private, you go to a park or whatever, right? There's something about that, like, oh, this is a shared space, right? And how do we, and that's why the third house is also related to sort of like the local transport system, like the short journeys that we make and things like that. And so there is that sort of like communal aspect that is naturally built there. But of course, everyone has different relationships to it. So yeah, that is something there about like unshaming process to with our environment that we are like consciously, are conscious or even not conscious of. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like what I found for myself is like locating sometimes locating the existence of shame is like the hardest part. So like
Mm,
feeling locating the existence of shame with my relationship to like the land under my house, say.
mm,
That is intense to come to.
yeah.
Right? Like, but it's like I feel that once that once I'm willing to be aware that there is shame here, it sort of
Mm-hmm.
naturally begins the unshaming process. Like
Yes.
it's awareness and the ability to see that actually begins the softening. It doesn't,
Yeah.
but I think um I feel like we often expect if I see it, then it's going to be even worse because we're going to have to like feel how uncomfortable that is. And yes,
Mm,
it's uncomfortable. But the magic of unshaming, I feel, is that sitting with that and just being with it, there's this softening that starts to happen. And then the relationality can be there where it once was like dissociated from us, you know?
yeah.
This is with
Yeah.
all beings, you know?
That's true. Yeah, because you like because yeah, the shame part of ourselves, like if you're not aware of it, then you can't even begin the process of unshaming, right? You're like, oh, okay. Like I'm like, yeah, like just acknowledging it and being aware that's already unshaming because shame doesn't want to be put on public. Like, like what are you talking about, Britain? Like, I don't want my shame to be spotlight on public.
That's me.
Yeah, and so that's like the discomfort, right, which is inherent in the shame itself. And so, but um, and we also think about like sometimes hyper exposure too. It can be bad or even detrimental in the sense that I was thinking about like, oh, but what if I so identify so much with my shame, right? And then it becomes a problem too, right? Where I'm like, um, for instance, I can even see this within myself where my past self was so like there are parts of me, at least in my past selves, younger self, that was sort of like I was so deep in that shame and that I was like, oh my God, like I have to like really strive for something. Like, I don't want to acknowledge it. Like I was just like but then although I was like slightly aware of it, but then it's not like you can just ignore it, right? Or then you come from a place of victimization where like where you see yourself as sort of like, oh yeah, this is something I can never move past or whatever have you, right? And so there's something there about like the the care, right, with regards to how that part of the shame, like the degree of exposure as
Mm.
as a shame part, and because we're also dealing with we're dealing with ourselves, right? But we are also dealing with other people's, perhaps, right? We're like, it's almost like if we're thinking about the third house as what I'm thinking, but then it can also be about like other perception of my thoughts. There's something there that we might be afraid to sort of like express as well, right? When I first came into being a spiritual, like calling myself a queer Muslim and things like that, there is that sort of like, oh my god, like I know I'm almost setting um myself up for some sort of like exposure, but then I know I can take it because I've sort of like worked through it myself in some ways, right? But then another person might not be able to do it, right, at the same gravity or whatever. So it's really about like understanding your own personal limits, yes, at the same time, like really believing yourself in the process of like that unshaming itself, right? Like for me, it was coming from like the idea of like, oh, I can't be queer at the same time being a practicing Muslim or something like that, right? And so those are sort of like even right now, like I would even say that like I'm still navigating that space, right? Unshaming that sort of like identity that I call myself, like that I sort of like declare for myself. So there's something there about for sure the third house, and um it is, and what's so funny too that um talking about siblings, and this is why I think it's important to point out, I think in the past or even in Vedic astrology, the third house is considered like the house of like weapons in a way, and it's kind of funny, and they talk about it because it's kind of like what is your arsenal in a way, like that's your weapon, and obviously it has to do with like your words are your weapon and things like that too, but like there is competition in the third house inherently, um, just because, and I was like, oh yeah, of course, it's kind of like it's like a debate, right? It's sort of like, oh, okay, I have thoughts on it, someone else has some thoughts on it as well, right? But it doesn't mean that my thoughts is less important or whatsoever. Um, and so there's some sort of like inherent competition to it, which can also further exacerbate that sense of shame, right? It's like, for example, you're in a class, right? And you're sort of like, oh my God, is it okay for me to share this, right? Like I can sound totally um like I didn't read anything or whatever, like sometimes we have those moments where, and for me too, I used to be like, because I remember, there's certain classes when I was in grad school, like I was like, I know I'll always have great questions, that sometimes there was a point where I was like, oh, I don't have a good question. Then I feel some sort of like weird itch and like kind of like guilty or like shame. I was like, oh my God, I have a very I don't know, beginner level question, I guess, or something like that, right? Which, so that's also like the tension that we're playing with, right? It's sort of like the idea of who we are, but then that's not a solid thing. We're always constantly learning about that third house. So I think because we're learning in the third house, and so that and so then like that's, I think, concept like learning is actually part of the unshaming in the third house, right? Like
Yeah.
learning, informing, changing our perspective is actually part of the third house work that we do, because especially because the third is when we're interface with like our lives, the first house interface with some sort of like the daily experience, then our understanding changes. Like as you say too, like about like you listen to a gossip or like you listen to someone says about something, you're like, oh wow, like never thought about it like that, right? Or something.
Mm.
And so discussion, like this too, like, it is also part of the unshaming of the third house. Like you have to say it, right? Like if you're like, obviously, you have to sort of like say it and you have to share it. And so what's funny and what's aligning with the third house too, I actually, a long time ago, my Substack was actually used like really just for personal writing before I switch to more like spiritual things and things like that. Like I think there's something about the third house as a house of writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or speaking your truth, right? Having an outlet for you to do that is part of the unshaming process. Um, because you're actually putting, there's something about just talking and having a document like this is very powerful, right? We're sort of like concretize it in time, right? I mean, obviously I can tell Britain, cut this out, blah, blah, blah. But like for the most part, I'm like, we're creating this sort of like time capsule for myself, but then I'm also, I'm actually being vulnerable, right? Saying something or expressing an opinion and things like that is such a vulnerable space, actually, right? Because that's how we're sort of like begin to interact with the environment. But then if there's a lot of shame there, then we're sort of like, oh my God, then we live in a place where, okay, am I not allowed to say anything about this at all? Right. And so that's why I feel that writing or journaling or doing some sort of like recording activity, very lunar too, right? Um, Putting our memories into some sort of like imprint of something, which the moon also rules like circulation. So like, whenever things circle, like the daily newspaper, right? That goes around. And so there's something about like putting those words and thoughts, whatever we have in our mind, into a paper, into a channel, music, whatever skills one have, art even, the third house can be about the skills in art, um, the oratory skills, and putting that is also part of like unshaming. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So much there. Yeah, I really am feeling here this like, um, one of the things that we see with shame is feeling like you don't have permission. Like,
Mm,
who's going to give me permission, And your unshaming devotions are, quote unquote, working.
mm-hmm,
If you notice that you're giving yourself more permission than you had before, the
mm,
universe was giving you. And I feel like what you're saying here around validating your thoughts or validating your words, like validating what you have to say, whether
mm-hmm,
that's privately in your journal as part of like a daily journaling practice, or whether that's like social media, because that's also included in the third house,
mm-hmm.
or like walking up to a group of people who are talking and just giving yourself permission to join a group of people.
Yeah,
Something that can be very confronting.
yeah.
Those all feel like powerful ways to consider unshaming the third house as a practice.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Wow, that's true. That's true. Yeah, and that's basically how I started. Sort of like I write because I was processing my shame, basically, right? I was writing in the when I first beginning of my Substack post. I was really talking about like there were moments where when I first discovered spirituality and things like that, right? It's almost like I was really putting some sort of like words to begin the unshaming process, right? To kind of like, okay, this is who I am now. Like this is how I'm conceptualizing thing, and this is where I'm at with life, right? So yeah, for sure. Like I really think that it is a very effective, at least for me and my experience. And even for others, I've seen it too, and how healing that process could be for them. And you care less about the audience too. You're like, because it is really about you, right? It is about your sort of like, what do you have to share with the world? Because I do believe that I do believe people naturally want to share in some ways. Like they do want to have, like, maybe that's the lunar like slash instinct in me of thinking of like, okay, I do believe people do want to caretake their environment in some level or capacity, right? And where do they begin to do that? Yeah, there's something about their third house, maybe their sign or their placements there, could really help them to cultivate that for themselves.
Thank you. That feels like a beautiful kind of like closure to what we've been sharing here. This has been so rich. Before I move us towards the end, was there anything that you had wanted to say about the third house that we did not get to?
Yeah, okay, let me just scroll it real quick. Um, I think we're good. Yeah, we talk about the spiritual things as well. Oh yeah, I was really thinking about like there's something about the third house being the heaven on earth kind of vibes. There's
Ooh,
something there.
yes.
Yes. And so that because I think I made a point about like finding the divine in the everyday, obviously. And so there's something about the third house, maybe part of the unshaming process is like, having that the bringing like the idea of like the heaven on earth vibes
Yeah.
to the third house for sure. Yeah.
Like drawing down the moon.
Yes, drawing down the moon's energy. Yeah, so that's the only other thing I had. Yeah.
That feels very loving. Well, tell the audience, for those who are loving listening to your voice, how they can
Mhm.
connect with you, and do you have any offerings coming up?
Yeah, okay. So for now, I'm doing my regular offerings. I always offer the birthday ones. That's something I really love doing. It's called Birthday Blend, but that's primarily sort of like astrology, looking at solar returns, looking at some sort of like um special monthly techniques and things like that. And then I also do some sort of like oracular channeling of the planets, since I do work with the planets in a theological sort of like way, and energy, planetary sort of like spiritual practice. And so I really love offering that as a birthday things. And recently, I guess more, I've been doing more like tarot plus astrology because I do have that combination. Because last year I stopped doing tarot purely, and then it sort of like transitioned into doing astrology and tarot together. So those are kind of like the two highlights that have been kind of like active in the past few months, and I can foresee that happening in the future too. So yeah.
Mm. And I love your Instagram so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I always try to produce there. Yeah, whenever I'm in the mood. Yeah. And so that's also another thing, right? Like I try not to sort of like, I love doing it. Like, this very third house of me to just like, oh, okay, sometimes I just do random things and really trust my knowing in a way too, like as much as I want to plan my social media, I don't, or, sometimes I do plan it, but then it always end up like in a certain way. And so I think that's something there about like, flowing with the third house for sure. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you so much, Shahir.
Thank you, Britain.
So beautiful. Thank you, Shahir. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Listeners, as I said at the beginning, I'll be sharing all the links to be connected to Shahir. I cannot recommend a consultation with more verb and deep knowing that if you feel called to Shahir's voice, you will be really glad that you gave that to yourself. So that was a rich one. We're now 3 houses in. Stay tuned for the remaining houses. I'm aiming to be releasing these every 2 to 3 weeks. So I'm a little slow to get the announcements out on Instagram because I'm just weaving this in where I have time and space with all the other things that I do. But given that this is like this big long-term project, I don't really feel a lot of urgency about that. This is living its own like long life. And I find that very sexy. If you don't want to miss these, inviting you to subscribe to Moon to Moon. And if you enjoy Moon to Moon, if you are enjoying what you're finding here, please leave a rating or review. Really appreciate that. It helps individuals trust the search, and like Moon to Moon shows up in a search. Having recent reviews is one of the most important things to have, to indicate to someone that they should give their precious time to listening to this. And so that's how you give back to me. That's how you give back to Moon, is by rating and reviewing. Thank you so much for doing that. Wishing everyone a beautiful September. I'll see you at the next one. Cheers.